campaign in the United States on foreign policy and national security, you have to begin with two variables. One is American power in the world today, which is global and hegemonic or imperial, depending on the way you want to look at it. I think the second element that we have to take in as a given is American values, which increasingly one might call Wilsonian, and which offer ideas about democracy and freedom in the world. Those are two givens. And what we learn every 4 years, and maybe now it's more often than that, is that the third important variable is the campaign, the elections, and how we see the world because of the way we elect our presidents and the way national security and foreign policy come into play. So our idea today is to bring two faculty members here who we feel together can represent the broad spectrum of thinking during this election campaign, and I'm going to introduce them together. First, on my left is Michael Nacht, who is the Aaron Wildowski Professor of Public Policy and Dean of the School of Public Policy, the Goldman School of Public Policy. And he has both of our panelists have very distinguished vitas, but I will only touch on their government service briefly. And in Michael's case, he was assistant head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in the Clinton administration, and he's been most recently an advisor to the Secretary of Defense on the problem of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. And our other distinguished faculty member here is John Yu, who's a professor of law in the law school and who was a law clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas in '93, and he most recently served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he worked on issues involving foreign affairs, national security, and the separation of powers. And of course, he's a professor of law at the Bolt Law School here. And so we will have each of our speakers talk for about up to 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions after they may ask each other's questions. So, Professor, you're welcome.
Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here. This is the third time I've had the pleasure of speaking at the IGS. And they all happen to be on topics that I thought when I started working on them were sufficiently obscure that would only be interest of academics. So one of the first subjects I started off on was the separation of powers, which I take in political sciences in the mid-90s was not that interesting a topic, and then the whole independent counsel thing happened. The second thing and then we had a panel on that. And then the second thing I used to work on was judicial review of the operation of states, and then Florida 2000 happened, and so I was on a panel on that. And then the third thing I worked on was the laws of war and war powers, which in the 90s was not all that popular topic too. I think many people thought in the 90s we had reached, or had written that we'd reached this sort of millennial future where there were not going to be any more wars, or that war, at least in constitutional law, was not that interesting a subject to study anymore. But here we are again. So let's just give you a short history of what I've done with this fine place. Let me make a few observations just about the presidential election part before discussing the substance of, I think, the difference between the two parties in the terrorism area. First is, it's unclear to me from the public debate what the real differences are between the Kerry and Bush administrations, at least in the handling of terrorism domestically. I think if you've been reading the media or watching television shows, as far as in terms of the salience of issues, the two primary things it seems to me there's some difference between the parties has been first whether to repeal portions of the Patriot Act. I believe Senator Kerry had said, at least during the primaries, that he was in favor of repealing some portions of it, and that the parts of the Patriot Act were unconstitutional. The second was the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, whether they ought to be implemented in full or only in part. That aside, I don't really know what the Kerry position is on a whole series of issues on which I think the Bush administration has some pretty clear policies, whether you agree with them or not. And so, for example, I'm not sure what the Kerry campaign thinks about the status of prisoners captured in the war on terrorism, whether they should be treated as formal prisoners of war or as illegal combatants. I don't know whether the Kerry campaign thinks that terrorists captured in the war on terrorism can only be treated as criminal defendants and tried through the federal courts, or whether one can detain them as enemy combatants, or whether one can try them with military commissions. I don't know, for example, what the Kerry campaign's view is on the use of the CIA and whether it should be employed aggressively in covert action abroad to fight terrorism. And I think, and this gets more into areas that I don't know about, but I think obviously it has to do with the dynamics of the campaign. And I have no greater insights than any of you about this, but it seems to me that the Kerry campaign has been somewhat passive in articulating policy differences between the two parties, and I would think of that as a failing of the campaign so far. I think there probably are differences, but they just haven't been pressed and articulated publicly. I think so far the campaign's been about who had better service during the Vietnam War, which it's not really seems to me an important issue to decide who should be president for the next 4 years. So that said, let me address some of those two issues: the Patriot Act and the 9/11 Commission report. And then turn also to some foreign affairs issues and whether there's differences in their anti-terrorism policies of the two potential administrations and the use of force. First, on the Patriot Act, and I guess we'll probably see more of this in the debate. I can certainly understand why Senator Kerry said during the primaries that portions of the Patriot Act were unconstitutional and ought to be repealed. This was certainly the view pressed by Mr. Governor Dean and some of the other. I think the Bush administration has no interest in repealing any portions of the Patriot Act. Personally, I think the Patriot Act, if you put aside the rhetoric over it and its terrible name, I think it is a bunch of reasonable, moderate, evolutionary changes in law enforcement powers that build on powers that the government already had. So to give you probably the chief example is what are called FISA warrants, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants, which allow one to get wiretaps or surveillance on terrorists. There's a lot of complaint that this occurs in secret courts, which is true. These warrants are granted by federal judges in classified hearings at which only the prosecution appears using classified evidence. The defendant is not notified of the fact of the search. One thing that I think is overlooked in the debate is that system was established in 1978 by Democratic Congress and signed by President Carter by overwhelming majorities in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. What the Patriot Act did is it made it easier to get those warrants, but it created no revolution in the way domestically that or at least the Justice Department and the FBI were the tools that they had to fight terrorism. And the FISA statute, by the way, is sort of the primary change that was made by the Patriot Act, with changes to that statute. The second thing is information sharing. I think the Patriot Act made some useful changes in information sharing between agencies. So there had been a wall that had been created between the foreign intelligence agencies on the one hand and the domestic law enforcement on the other. I don't think that people think this is a bad idea, that that wall should be taken down, that there should be information shared commonly about terrorists and terrorism suspects between the two agencies. I don't know if that's part of the Patriot Act that Senator Kerry would want to repeal. I'd be surprised it would be, because, as we'll get to in a second, that's one of the primary recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. Third, I think there's a great uproar, or there was, that the Patriot Act was infringing civil liberties in a serious, systematic way. I don't think there's any empirical proof of that. And in fact, last summer, the Senate Judiciary Committee held hearings where noted, conservatives like Joe Biden and Dianne Feinstein said that they had no evidence that there had been civil liberties violations due to the Patriot Act. So I think calls for repeal of the Patriot Act and arguments that it's unconstitutional, and maybe they've died off. That still, was a publicly announced position that separated the two administrations. I would be very surprised if that happened. I think it would be a serious mistake. On the other hand, I think both political parties get a lot of advantage from claiming that the Patriot Act was really a great revolution. It helps the Bush administration to claim it was a great change because it makes it look like it was a significant legislative achievement. I think for a period of time during the primaries, the Democratic Party, or at least some of the nominees in the party, got a big benefit from claiming it was a great revolutionary change because that appealed to the civil liberties wing of the party. But I don't think in reality that it really had that effect. And I can't think that in the end we really would repeal parts of the Patriot Act. And during the questions and answer, I'm happy to discuss any more particular provisions of it. The 9/11 Commission report. The primary recommendation of the report that's gotten most attention has been whether to centralize the control over the intelligence agencies and a national intelligence director who would be a cabinet level position, have control over budgets and personnel. And the Kerry campaign has said we want to adopt all those changes in toto. The Bush administration initially, I think, opposed them, but has over time gradually accepted parts of it here and there. I guess I have two thoughts on that. One is I don't think it's going to make a big difference. Centralizing more power in a national intelligence director of cabinet level rank, is that really going to stop terrorist attacks? Is it really going to help the government run more efficiently in the intelligence area? It seems to be a response every time something happens to create a new cabinet level position the way we do with the Homeland Security Department, but I think it's open to doubt whether that really helps the government or the United States combat terrorism. If anything, you might suspect that it might hurt. One argument that people who study bureaucracies have made is that it might be a good idea to have diversity amongst the agencies that compete to provide their own evaluations of common evidence, rather than having one single voice that provides one intelligence product to the president or to policymakers. It might be helpful to have 2 or 3 different agencies providing their own review. To the extent that you have centralization of intelligence, that might disappear. That's not to say that we shouldn't share information. I think, as the 9/11 Commission recommended, it does make sense to have a common pooling of the information, but certainly it would make sense, it seems to me, to have diversity in the people who evaluate the intelligence. In the other domestic areas, I don't think that there's going to be much difference in terms of what the two administrations would do. Think about the different issues that we can talk about: border security, searching cargo containers, giving more money to first responders, giving more money to local police. I think the federal government could spend endlessly in all these areas. I think the only thing the two administrations would differ in would be exactly how much to fund, but I don't think anyone's in favor of not funding these things. And I don't think either administration has some radically different proposal or policy on any of these issues that would make a significant difference. I think in the end, both administrations would end up doing the same thing. I do think that there are big differences in stated views about, maybe now turning more to, what certainly Dean Nacht is far more of an expert than I on, is the international or sort of foreign policy arena. On some things, I don't think there would be much of a difference. So, for example, the invasion of Afghanistan. If Gore or Kerry had been president on 9/11, I think they would have invaded Afghanistan too. I could be wrong about that, but I think they would have. They obviously have a dispute about Iraq, and Senator Kerry's views have been different on Iraq, or at least that's what it appears to me to be. He did vote for the resolution to authorize the use of force. I don't know whether he voted for and then against the appropriation for the occupation of Iraq. Seems, I guess, in the last speech just this week, he has now said he would not have used force in Iraq if he were president. I don't know whether that's based on knowing everything he knows now or everything he knew then. But I think Iraq's not the important question at this point. I think what really is important is how the two administrations would handle the problems of proliferation, and particularly the questions of North Korea and Iran. Now, certainly both, I think Senator Kerry says we ought to cooperate more. I don't think President Bush is saying that we shouldn't cooperate. Right? I think that maybe in practice they'd be able to get more cooperation one party will get more cooperation than another in getting North Korea or, say, Iran to change its policies. I doubt it. In this area, I fully trust France to act in its own national self-interest, as they seem to do all the time. And whether France is going to cooperate with the United States, I think, will just depend on what the Kerry administration and the Bush administration is willing to offer France. I don't think it depends on just which one is president. And I don't see what the difference in overall strategy in the end would be between the Kerry and the Bush administration, say, over North Korea and Iran. I think, for example, the Bush administration is seen as being more bellicose, but at the same time, right now, the Bush administration is pursuing a diplomatic solution through the IAEA and ultimately maybe the UN Security Council about Iran. With North Korea, the Bush administration, I think, is pursuing negotiations now. Whether the Bush administration was right to drop the agreed framework that had agreed on under the Clinton administration, I don't know. I don't know whether the Kerry administration would have kept to it, given what we discovered about North Korea's nuclear weapons programs. I think, and here I'll end here. I don't want to go too long. The last point, and maybe this gets more into philosophy, not philosophy, but more into grand foreign policy, is do you think that the Kerry administration is going to be very different in terms of foreign policy philosophy than the Bush administration? Is the Kerry administration going to be more realist than the Bush administration? I think there's confusion in the debate about this. I mean, Harry referred to Wilsonianism, right? Some of the criticism of the Bush administration's foreign policy has been, in some ways, too Wilsonian, that it has tried to cause domestic revolution in societies like Afghanistan or like in Iraq, when it could just have easily, for example, left a dictator in power who maintained order, and at least they would have been the dictator on the side of the United States. And from this perspective, is the Kerry administration going to be significantly different? Is it going to be more realist and less Wilsonian than the Bush administration, which would be an odd thing, because I think over the last 30 or 40 years, at least the common perception is that Democratic administrations have been more Wilsonian than Republican administrations, whether that's actually true or not. So maybe this will be the difference, but that would mean that perhaps the Kerry administration, the Bush administration, would in the end be very different in their attitudes towards Europe, in their attitudes towards cooperation with non-governmental organizations, and their attitudes toward the United Nations. Does that mean, for example, that Senator Kerry's administration would defer to the UN Security Council's choices on the use of force? I doubt it. That would be the more realist position, actually, would be to defer less to the Security Council. The Bush administration, I think, has worked with the United Nations in some areas, but not others. So so in part, I think there are some differences, but I can't really, and I think we all have a pretty good sense of where the Bush administration is on these matters. I think the Bush administration is Wilsonian, but aggressively Wilsonian, the fact that it will use force to achieve Wilsonian goals, where it seems to be at the outset practical, but in other areas like North Korea and Iran, it is willing to use diplomatic tools to achieve its ends. I don't see how the Kerry administration would be significantly different were it to take office in those areas. So just at closing then, I do think that there are differences. And let me just say, obviously, terrorism does seem to be the most important issue, or it has in the polls been the most important issue. I think so far, though, it's been difficult to detect the serious policy differences, except for maybe the Patriot Act and 9/11 Commission report, because I think the presidential campaign so far has been fixated on these issues of personal background. Thanks.
Well, I too am happy to be back at IGS, and I interpret my role slightly differently, I think, than John interpreted his. I'm going to try to summarize as fairly as I can what I think the Bush positions are during the campaign on national security issues, and what the Kerry positions are in the campaign on national security issues, and not try to interject too much of my own personal thoughts about this, but I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. First, one prefatory comment, and it's been said a number of times now, but I think it's worth repeating, that actually if you reflect back on U.S. presidential elections, in my view, this is the first presidential election since 1980 where national security and foreign policy have been hugely significant issues in the election. 2000 election, Gore, Bush, I know for a fact that Gore was instructed not to discuss foreign policy because every moment he spent on foreign policy was a distraction from the voters who were only interested in domestic policy. So that was hardly raised. And of course, Bush had no foreign policy experience, so he didn't raise it. It was almost totally absent from the 2000 campaign. In 96, when Clinton won re-election against Dole, it was largely absent. In 1992, it was the economy stupid. We had the winning war in the Persian Gulf. 92 election was not about foreign policy. Even in 88, the famous Dukakis ad where he was in a tank, which was very damaging to his campaign, was largely a sideshow and was mostly about domestic issues. Even in 84, when Reagan demolished Mondale, there was actually, and it was the height of the Cold War, there was some discussion about, of course, how we handled the Soviet Union, but it was already kind of receding a little bit. It was only in 1980 when Carter was running for re-election against Governor Reagan from California, and we had the Iranian hostage crisis and the humiliation of the Americans in Iran, and only 5 years since the collapse of the South Vietnamese government, when foreign policy was an important issue. So this is, for some of you in this room, the first time in your lifetime that foreign policy and national security have been a key issue. It's not the only issue, but the polls are showing that the economy and Iraq and the war on terrorism are three of the top four issues, with probably healthcare also up there. There's some difference in the rank order. Okay, so given that, what are the candidates saying? And I would like to just briefly summarize my sense of what they're saying on 5 areas. The global war on terrorism, or as they say in Washington, GWAT, the war in Iraq, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, with reference particularly to the Iranian and North Korean case, but also to some others that I'll mention, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and both civil liberties and homeland security. Let me just quickly summarize my sense. And I do think that the candidates are trying to say quite different things here. I think that Bush has been more consistent and clearer and simpler in what he has said than what Kerry has said. But I think there are important differences. We'll see over the next 6 weeks or 5 weeks that are left what these differences will be further elaborated upon. On the GWAT, on the global war on terrorism, I think what the Bush administration and what President Bush and Vice President Cheney are saying is that this is a horrible struggle against a fairly substantial number of radical fundamentalist Islamic extremists, still a tiny percentage of the Muslim world, tiny percentage, but still mobilized. And that with these people, it's a fight to the death. Either they're going to kill us or we're going to kill them. It's really not much more complicated than that. And in fact, President Bush yesterday at the United Nations said it is the duty of every civilized country to confront the murderers. And when something happens, like happened yesterday, where an American hostage was beheaded, it accentuates the seemingly correct analysis of President Bush. The first thing that, of course, was done that triggered this was despite the fact that we had several other attacks beforehand, that the 9/11 attack was something that we really couldn't have anticipated. We had knowledge, we didn't know exactly where or when, we didn't know if they get this far. It happened, it was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. We, the administration, responded in Afghanistan, we destroyed the Taliban, we put in a government in Afghanistan that's slowly but surely restoring women's rights. It's going to have national elections. Afghanistan of 2004 is radically better and different than it was in 2000. That's a key element of the global war on terrorism. And we're pursuing them all over the world. We're trying to draw up their financial support. And it's a full court press against these people in every way. Politically, militarily, diplomatically, economically, psychologically, culturally. In every way, we're going after these people. It's not getting easier in some sense because they're morphine. It's complicated. It's a large number of loosely affiliated networks now, but we have a game plan. That's and furthermore, that the Iraqi war is an element of the global war on terrorism. It's integrally related. It's sort of like a campaign of a war. It's sort of like the North African campaign of the Second World War, for those of you who know anything about that. And, in campaigns of wars, sometimes things don't go so well. There are ups and downs. But overall, it was worth doing. We may have been mistaken about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but Hussein was a tyrant of unimaginable proportions. There are several 100,000 dead bodies in mass graves in Iraq that are testimony to this. And one could never know for certain if and when he reconstituted his programs that he wouldn't use them or hand them off to others who would use them against us. So that's sort of a central element of, and I, George Bush, am resolute, I'm determined, I'm not going to change my mind in the afternoon from the morning, I'm not going to change my mind if I speak to John Yoo or speak to Harry Kreisler. My views are the same tomorrow as they are today. And consistency and clarity and simplicity and steadfastness is an integral part of the fight of the war on terrorism. You have to hang in there. In a way, I mean, he probably wouldn't use this, but it's sort of like George Bush is saying, what Woody Allen said was right. 90% of the job is showing up. You got to show up every day and do it and not waver. The Kerry view is rather different, but I would say he has articulated different things at different times. First, that it's conceivable, one can conceive that even the 9/11 attack was preventable because there was a lot of information out there, and Bush and the top Bush administration leaders did not take it seriously enough. We have the testimony of Clark. We have the views about, from what O'Neill said. We have other people in the administration, formerly in the administration, who said they just didn't really believe that the threat was as serious as the counterterrorism experts thought it was. And, we suffered the consequences. Afghanistan was probably the right way to go after 9/11, and I don't think Kerry has made an issue at all of going into Afghanistan. I agree completely with John. Frankly, I think if Gore had been elected, there would have been an attack on Afghanistan after 9/11, although I can't prove it. But where there is a difference is whether we would have stayed in Afghanistan with larger forces, with more economic assistance, with more educational programs to really try and make the military gains permanent societal gains. And what Kerry is beginning to say is that because Bush diverted so much attention, manpower, treasure, psychology, intelligence in every way, to Iraq, we kind of lost interest in Afghanistan. And as a result, Afghanistan is actually in a precarious position now. The Taliban has reconstituted itself in various ways. If you spend any time there, the warlords are controlling large sections of the country. Karzai, the president, is considered to be the mayor of Kabul, not the president of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan could have been done better, but it wasn't. And not only that, since allegedly bin Laden and al-Zawahiri and the leadership of al-Qaeda were there, the fact that we didn't pursue them to the ends of the earth, instead got diverted into Iraq, was a huge mistake. Iraq, I think Kerry has a record on this, which is tricky for him to defend publicly. But in his most recent speech at NYU on Monday, he tried, I think, in the clearest, simplest way to articulate his position. And it was that he supported the authorization to use all necessary means to root out Saddam Hussein. And that's, Washington gobbledygook for going to war. But Kerry claims that he would not have then gone to war, as Bush did, without seeking further United Nations support and without giving the weapons inspectors more time to find these elusive weapons of mass destruction, which they never did find. He has not commented really too much recently on the $87 billion of support for the men and women of the U.S. forces in Iraq. Bush has said that Iraq has gone, it's mixed, but we're making progress. The glass is more half full than half empty. Kerry has said the glass is almost empty in Iraq, and that what we're seeing here is the beginnings of a Vietnam-like commitment with no end in sight, just more murder, more mayhem, more bombings, more killings every day, and not an ability to get a handle on this situation. The Bush counter would be, look, we have an interim president, we're going to have elections, and so forth. The counter by Kerry is, a lot of the major cities are in the hands of insurgents. And you've got Sunni groups and Shia groups that we never expected to be fighting, now we're fighting a year and a half after Bush said that mission accomplished. So I think he will continue to press, Kerry will continue to press the differences between his position and Bush's position on Iraq, especially if Iraq continues to seemingly deteriorate. And as of now, it doesn't show any signs of change. There were some major new explosions today in Baghdad. This will actually play out, I think, most graphically in the debates. And the first debate on September 30th at the University of Miami is quite significant because that is the debate devoted solely to foreign policy. So I will now editorialize and say I think that if Kerry cannot make a strong case of the differences between himself and Bush on Iraq on September 30th, then I think he's got a harder road to hoe than if he can. On weapons of mass destruction, the Bush administration again says, look, these are difficult problems. First of all, we have a huge success. We have a success in Libya. When we went into Iraq, the Libyans who were negotiating quietly with us before suddenly became very interested in giving up all their stuff. And I would say, to be fair, I think most observers believe that Gaddafi clearly had developed increased motivation to come to an agreement once he saw the 82nd Airborne go to Iraq. So Bush says, this is the way you do it. You may have to kill a few people, then you put your gun on the table, and they say, would you like to be next? And they say, no, where are the cupcakes? Let's do something different. I think Kerry yields to Bush on Libya, but he claims that Iran and North Korea have been permitted to fester, develop nuclear programs largely unimpeded, with not enough attention paid to them by the Bush leadership, and also a rather hostile, belligerent, confrontational approach to both, without any sense of the need for some carrots as well as sticks. The theme of Kerry on Iran and North Korea is we need a mix. We need carrots and sticks. We need to have credible threats, but also positive incentives. The model, if you will, which many of you may not be familiar with, has to do with the denuclearization of the Ukraine, which happened in the 90s when I was in the Clinton administration. Basically, Ukraine suddenly woke up in January 1992 as an independent country with a large number of nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union, which it was part of December 31st, 1991. And ultimately, through some very arduous negotiations, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons in return for a very complex package of energy, security, political assurances, political ties, economic assistance, national security involvement, and all the rest. I think Kerry is willing to propose on both Iran and North Korea this kind of package of incentives. Not that this will do the trick, but he's willing to propose it and engage bilaterally, I think, with these governments in Tehran and Pyongyang to see if they're willing to reach a kind of grand bargain. Bush is not. At least there's no evidence that he is yet. Bush is basically saying, look, we cannot let the world's worst tyrants have the world's most dangerous weapons. If they can continue like this, we're going to ratchet up the pressure, and ultimately we're going to confront them. And I personally believe, it's just an editorial now, that if President Bush is reelected, Iran and North Korea will be at the very top of the agenda in early spring 2005. And they will be banner headlines that thick about what's going to happen in North Korea and Iran. Israeli-Palestinian issue. Now, this actually has gotten very little play during the presidential campaign. It's hardly mentioned at all by either candidate, by either campaign. They both have briefing books this thick on it, but the political advisors have basically convinced the candidates, I guess, not to touch it. In large measure, the Bush administration has said, look, we support a two-state solution. No U.S. government has ever articulated support for a two-state solution before, but you have to have responsible people who you can negotiate with. And the Palestinians have not produced responsible leadership. They produced Arafat, and in the Bush terms, he's a thug, a killer, a mass murderer, a terrorist, a crook, a tyrant. He's got $5 billion of his own money in Swiss bank accounts while his people starve to death. He's been in power 40 years. You don't deal with a guy like this. And until they're able to throw him out and get somebody we can talk with, we're not going to talk with him. And we don't want the Israelis, we don't care if the Israelis don't have to talk with him either. And on that, and even on that score, you've got Hamas, which is to the right of Arafat, who has more extreme demands than Arafat vis-a-vis Israel, at least more articulated extreme demands. So therefore, Israel has to do its thing, although Bush was actually condemnatory of Israel at the UN just yesterday when he said that Israel has to stop humiliating the Palestinians and has to close up some of the illegal settlements. Kerry has not articulated, to my knowledge, virtually anything on this issue, but I think basically what he has said and what he would do is more in the tradition of previous U.S. Democratic administrations, which is to engage. Engage is a sort of an honest broker, of a negotiator, a mediator, as Clinton did with Barack and with Arafat, as Carter did with Sadat and Begin. And just saying U.S. involvement, constant involvement, steady pressure, the Secretary of State, lots of trips, lots of meetings, lots of paper, lots of briefings. You have to keep pushing the problem every single day to make progress. And it's important in and of its own right to solve this horrible problem where thousands of people have been killed on each side, but also because it would remove one of the grievances, not the only grievance, not even the central grievance, but one of the grievances that the Islamic extremists have for prosecuting terrorism in the first place. Finally, civil liberties and national security. There, I think, the Bush position, again, is relatively straightforward, which is we needed the Patriot Act in order to enhance our national security. Again, a quick Michael comment. In a democracy, you have an inherent tension between national security and civil liberties. I see it as like a seesaw or teeter-totter. In periods of low perceived threat, let's call that the late 1990s, civil liberties are available to everyone on all counts. So if Michael had to run to SFO and get there 20 minutes before a flight in the year 2000, I might be able to convince somebody to get on the plane. I was at a meeting, I talked too much, I got here late, no problem. If I go to SFO now and I'm there 20 minutes before a flight, but they take off my belt, they smell my pants, they look in my socks, they ask me 600 questions, This is a great infringement on my civil liberties. But they're saying they're not doing it to harass me. They're doing it because if I go on the plane and blow it up or send it into the World Trade Center, a lot of people are going to get killed. So there's an inherent tension between the two, and in times of high perceived threat, and as a nation we are in a period of high perceived threat, civil liberties get constrained. The issue is how, where, when, which ones. And we have, frankly, fortunately in a democracy, an infinite debate about which ones. So the Bush administration says, look, the Patriot Act has helped. They may have gotten Padilla, the dirty bomb guy in Chicago. They got maybe the Buffalo crowd that were a bunch of insurgents extremists planning a terrorist attack, and other people. And Homeland Security, we've had a lot of programs. We have biodefense programs. We're providing money now through the Department of Homeland Security, and we're doing the best we can. It takes a long time. And they can point to quite a number of things that they've done in the last 3 years. The Kerry response is that the civil liberties have been unnecessarily constricted, and that Ashcroft in particular personifies someone who was actually undemocratic, and he's someone who was a threat to American civil liberties. And he would be certainly replaced by someone with completely different views about how to enhance national security, but at the same time enforce civil liberties. On Homeland Security, Kerry says, look, the Bush administration opposed the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. They opposed a lot of increased funding for Homeland Security. They now say, look, we're spending $200 billion on Iraq. We can't afford increased programs for Homeland Security. And Kerry will say, look, one of the reasons that we can't afford the money for Homeland Security is because we're spending $200 billion in Iraq. And we wouldn't have spent $200 billion in Iraq if I had been president or if I would be president and so forth. So I think overall there are what the candidates are saying are quite distinct. I think that, clearly, my final comment, the Republican base believes in a nutshell, and the Republican base is huge. One, the global war on terrorism is a fight to the death. Two, we made a lot of progress in Afghanistan. Three, Iraq had a lot of surprises, but it's just a campaign and a war, and it's better today without Hussein than it was yesterday with Hussein. That Iran and North Korea you have to confront. You can't, sweet talk them. That the Israeli-Palestinian thing is hopeless as long as you got these kinds of Palestinian leaders. And that civil liberty constraints have protected the Americans against attack, and the proof of the pudding there is there's been no new attack since 9/11. The Democratic base doesn't believe any of that. Democratic base, which may be more prevalent in Berkeley, that's just a wild guess on my part, is that a lot of the global war on terrorism was mishandled or unnecessary. Maybe we partly provoked it ourselves. We have crummy policies. We should have done something maybe earlier. That Afghanistan we screwed up. That Iraq is a total disaster. That we're just Iran and North Korea relations are symptomatic of how we are viewed in the whole world, which is everybody hates us. That the Israeli-Palestinian thing has been totally mishandled because we basically opted out, and that civil liberties are being violated. So the bases clearly have totally different views. I think they have almost nothing in common with each other, almost nothing. One of the issues for the political experts, Nelson Polsby, if he's still here, other people in the room, is, who are their undecided voters and what do they think and how will they be persuaded? It was alleged that there were small numbers, but after the Republican convention, Bush got a big bounce. So somehow there were more undecided than we thought. I think that part of the game here is beyond the issues, and this is my final comment. It's about how these individuals present themselves as leaders for these problems. And you have someone in Bush who, as I've said, presents a very clear, consistent, on-message, no deviation, tough-minded, kind of middle America approach. And you have Kerry, who has been more cerebral, more sensitive, more analytical. These are not words that most Americans know anything about and could care less about. He really needs in the next several weeks to sharpen his message and to make the differences clearer in the debates. Final comment is that it may well be that events completely outside the campaign will determine the outcome. If there's another attack here of significant proportions, I think it's hard to say how it'll play. I think at this stage it probably will help President Bush, unless it could be attributed to malfeasance on the part of the administration. There could be some other horrendous things that happen elsewhere in the world or in Iraq that could hurt the Bush administration. It may well be that some combination of the debates and external events will determine the outcome rather than anything I've been discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Did you want to comment? Either of you want to comment on the other's position?
Yeah. I agree with exactly the way Dean Nacht summarized the stated positions of the different campaigns. I wonder, one comment I'd make is I wonder if Kerry or Bush won, given world conditions and limitations of resources and positions, whether policy in the end would really be that different in terms of what they did, whether they are in office. So just to take the non-proliferation area, which you have really done quite a bit of work in. The Bush administration probably would love to have a Ukraine solution for North Korea and Iran too, right? It's not that the Bush administration would rather bomb people. Believe it or not, I don't think the Bush administration would rather bomb people than to achieve a diplomatic solution in these areas. I think the difficult question is, does North Korea have any interest in a diplomatic solution? If they don't, it seems to me Kerry and Bush are faced with the same circumstances, whether to use force ultimately to stop North Korea from having a nuclear weapon. I would think, given what we've seen in Iraq, that Bush would probably use force in that situation. I don't really think Kerry wouldn't. I think given what we've seen in the campaign so far, Kerry in some cases has said, he would use force in the exact same circumstances. So that's just a point in the non-proliferation. I think on the civil liberty, also on the Iraq issue, another example. I think Iraq, in some ways, the issue is one about accountability, about past decisions. But again, going forward, given how much resources we've put into Iraq, given the prestige of the country that's gone into going into Iraq, are Kerry and Bush really going to be that different in trying to find a solution to get us out of Iraq? Again, I don't know whether there will be a huge difference in actually what happens when they're both in the White House. The Civil Liberties Patriot Act, Homeland Security issue, again, I think there is a difference there. Maybe it's best encapsulated in asking, is there a difference in the Republican versus Democratic Party and whether they view it actually as a war? Maybe that's probably the easiest way to encapsulate. I think it is quite clear the Bush administration considers the war on terrorism to be a war like previous wars, in the sense that use military force, law enforcement is part of it, but is not the primary or only means of combating terrorism. And that has a whole lot of consequences associated with it, right? The use of force against individuals, detention as enemy combatants, no federal district court trials for detainees, aggressive use of the CIA. But again, I think in the campaign, what I detect with the Kerry administration is actually trying to outflank the Bush administration to the right, and saying in some ways the Bush administration has not been aggressive enough in the war on terrorism. If that's the case, then does the Kerry administration really believe that the GWOT, the global war on terrorism, really is not a war, and that law enforcement tools are the primary method? I mean, there are people in the Democratic Party, especially in the primaries, who made those kind of arguments that we ought to be using more cooperative, multilateral law enforcement techniques to fight the war on terrorism, that our use of force had actually undermined cooperative efforts like that. But I don't hear the Kerry administration making that claim anymore. I think it'd be very difficult for them in this environment, if the war on terrorism is one of the number one issues, for either of the candidates to suddenly say this is not a war and we should start restricting the tactics we're going to use in the war on terrorism. But if that's the case, I mean, that could be an area of difference. I think, as you say, Bush is very clear and consistent on that. I'm just not sure what the Kerry campaign's real approach to whether the war on terrorism really is a war, or if it's the war on drugs and the war on poverty, if it's just a persistent social problem that we rhetorically call a war.
Quickly, just to take each of the 3 points that John raised. On weapons of mass destruction, in fact, actually on all 3, I would say that one of the things that's a little hard to know in advance, because we don't know what a Kerry administration would be like. Personalities matter, and people matter, and how people approach other people matters. Well, we've had 4 years of seeing how President Bush and his colleagues approach other governments and other leaders. They've had some success. Tony Blair was a great example of that. Not the British people, not even the British government, but the Prime Minister. And in Eastern Europe, formerly Eastern Europe, the governments there are hugely supportive of President Bush. If you spend time in Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, the Baltic states, because these are all countries that suffered for 50 years under communism or more, and they view the Americans as their protector, and they're happy to help out now, given what has happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in many other cases, it's been very difficult, and we have very acrimonious relations. So I think part of what Kerry is saying is, look, I don't have the baggage that this guy has. I can really sit down with these people with a de novo, a fresh record, and say, look, Iraq is a problem for all of us. Now, what is it you guys can do to help? Now, they each have, as John rightly says, their own self-interest. They've got huge domestic constraints on what they can do. But at least it's plausible to believe that he could enlist greater international support because he hasn't gone through a period of alienating so many key governments that Bush has had. It's not guaranteed. It may not work. And, of course, it's not just the president. It's also the other top leaders. I mean, I think Powell has made a valiant effort to do this wherever he's been, and he's gone all over the world. And he's probably one of the Americans' most prominent and favored people in other countries of the world. But I think he's lost out on a lot of the key decisions in the Bush administration. So, again, I think there would be more effort to enlist other governments in helping to provide carrots and sticks for Iraq, for Iran, for North Korea, And on the civil liberties front also there would be, I think, a change, and you'd have a very different sort of person, at least, who would be Attorney General, who would seek to kind of articulate and defend the needs for constraints without seeking to alienate and frighten a lot of people in the process.
Before we open up, I would like to actually do a brief synthesis and ask a question myself, and that is what I hear both of our guests saying is that there really is an awful lot of consensus and agreement about the direction we take, with some exceptions. And it seems to me that the interesting question that raises is a big conceptual one, which may tell us why we're getting off on things like Vietnam War records and so on that have no relevance. And that is the whole notion of a global war on terrorism. I remember a while back being at a party, and a very prominent Berkeley historian, who I will not name, who was very conservative in the Cold War, came up to me and he asked me, he said, "What is a war on terrorism?" Terrorism is a tactic, basically. So there's a very interesting thing going on here, and it's something that the neocons are very conscious of. I had the opportunity to interview David Frum, who was Bush's speechwriter and very influential in the key moments after 9/11 with Richard Pearl. And he saw as actually pivotal the conceptualization that this was a war on terrorism. And the interesting problem that raises, it makes it very unclear how you act in particular situations. You're very dependent on intelligence, which may be very bad. Or you can pick and choose the sides you want to take. But it does limit your leverage, because terrorism was traditionally seen as a tactic which was used by groups within a national struggle to determine the future of that country. So that, for example, the incident in Breslin, which is a real, terrible act, which clearly involves some Al-Qaeda elements, but also is part of the whole problem of how Russia deals with the Chechenian rebellion. The same is true with, influencing events in Pakistan other than the war on Al-Qaeda and so on. So I'm just raising this point that it becomes very difficult to then distinguish why you would go into Iraq, why you would go here and not there. And I think that it's right that there's a consensus here and everybody's buying into that. The other point that I would make in this regard, and then open it up to questions, is that, for example, on the war on Iraq, the very interesting thing that one can say in defense of the Bush administration, and there's not much to defend there, is there was something called regime change, or the Iraq Liberation Act, which President Clinton signed, actually, and which all the leading Democrats pushed through the Senate, which endorsed regime change. And then finally, which leads me to the newest point, and then I'll open the floor. I'm just making a general comment about the poor quality of the debate, the extent to which the poor quality of that debate covers up incompetence. That is, if both are agreed on something, are we pursuing these routes in the most competent way? But interestingly enough, Mr. Bolton, the Undersecretary of State, was somewhere. He was in Israel somewhere, I think, and he was suggesting, among other things, that regime change in Iran would settle the proliferation problem, basically. So that if we had democratization in Iran, then they would not be a danger, because as a democracy, they wouldn't want nuclear weapons, I guess is the logic. Well, that's, so all I'm saying is that in the confusion of this debate, a lot is getting confused, and the voters aren't being empowered to think through the choices they want to make. That's all I would say.